Sheppard. I think I knew him first through a rather wonderful article that he wrote when he was, I suppose, still contemplating an academic career on angels and inscriptions about angels with faintly biblical names from the region of Roman Asia Minor, intriguing, probably Judaizing inscriptions, which certainly caught my attention when I started to work on those matters. And then I think I probably met Anthony's wife to be and other distinguished members of her academic family before I met him. However, we have known each other for a good while as co-speakers at Limud and in all sorts of other cultural contexts. So Anthony is a man of many parts. He is, which perhaps his bio doesn't say, the leading light of the British school at Ankara and still involved in archaeology in the region of Turkey. He's worked on inscriptions from there, but he moved on from a potential academic career to work in other fields, continuing to publish articles and now returning to research in the Hellenistic Jewish field, working on that wonderful romance, Joseph and Asenath. Previously, actually, he not long ago wrote an article on a Christian text, the Epistle of Barnabas. So wide-ranging and with an intriguing title, Fuzzy Frontiers and Funny Faiths. Anthony's going to talk about, again, some sites, Jewish sites in Asia Minor of late antiquity and what they represent in terms of understandings of Judaism in that rather puzzling world. So, Anthony, without more ado.
Thank you very much, Tessa. There, very briefly, is my title. I will now put this into. Whoops! I need to move this along a bit. Thank you. Put this into slideshow. Whoops! Slideshow. Yeah. So my slightly strange title, which I hope may provide a little entertainment. I'm very honoured by the invitation from Tessa and your committee to lecture to you. I hope those expecting a strictly archaeological occasion will not be too disappointed. As Tessa indicated, I'm somebody who really comes from a background in ancient history and wandered into the study of Greek inscriptions in Asia Minor, of which there are a very large number. So this will be a talk completely free of post holes or complicated stratigraphic sequences or anything like that. I should explain that my role with the British Institute at Ankara is that of honorary treasurer. Keeping the finances on the straight and narrow in fairly challenging times, but we survive. And I see a number of colleagues from Turkey are here, so welcome to those. Hoş geldiniz to Turkish colleagues who are attending. What I'm going to talk about, therefore, this afternoon is the Greek-speaking diaspora of the Roman East, particularly in Asia Minor, and its possible influence on contemporary religious life among pagans. Now, I use influence in a fairly loose way, as you will see. Oops. So I begin with an extract from a rabbinic text well known in the Jewish world, the Pirkei Avot, which is a collection of pithy sayings on moral and other topics, probably dating from the early 3rd century CE, which refers, among other things, it deals with the transmission of Torah, of Jewish law and tradition from Moses onwards, through the biblical figures. And then it comes to a somewhat mysterious outfit known as the Men of the Great Assembly, who referred to, among other things, making a fence round the Torah, making a fence round Jewish law and teaching. And the 2nd century Rabbi Akiva is said to have said something similar. Now, whatever exactly is meant by a fence around the Torah, and we're not going to divert into a lecture on rabbinics, you'll be glad to hear, clearly the setting of some sort of boundary to what counts as Jewish observance and tradition is intended. And obviously, boundaries can be various degrees of permeability, from those intended to be unpassable, the picture of Hungarian immigration policy top left, those which can be passed with difficulty, the picture top right of Syrian refugees literally bursting through the Turkish border fences at some stage earlier in the Civil War, or they may be almost invisible, as is the Norway-Sweden border at the bottom. So the discussion I want to pursue starts in the great and wealthy city of Aphrodisias in the southwest of Turkey, whose city council chamber appears here, had links to the Jewish community of the city, as we will see in a moment. Aphrodisias prospered mightily in the Roman world. It was notable, among other things, for a long-running and remarkable school of sculptures, but I'm just going to be focused on the Jewish community. There is a much discussed inscription from Aphrodisias, which suggests that the fence round the Jewish community of that city was pretty permeable as late as the 4th century CE, in spite of the shrill attempts of the church to define itself over against Judaism, and from about 330, legal restrictions on Jews imposed by Christian emperors. So in the Aphrodisias Museum is a long and remarkable inscription from the Jewish community, which appears here. The stone carried 2 inscriptions on different sides. One is a long list, seen here, of names, probably of benefactors, including several with Jewish names, and concluding with a list of those who reverence God, in Greek, Theos Hypsistos. This list of those who reverence God starts with 9 city councillors, by definition, wealthy members of the local elite. There are nearly 50 names of Jews, some are lost at the top, and altogether 51 Theos Hypsistos. The section below the gap on the side starts also those who reverence God, Zeno the councillor. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that in a bit more detail. Just below this gap, it begins there. Those who reverence God, Zenon the councillor, and then there's a list of the other people who reverence God. The other side, which is not in photographs, has a less well-cut text, beginning in a free translation, which begs a lot of textual questions we haven't time to go into now. God is our help. Donors, or some word which is pretty well missing, to the soup kitchen. The members of the minyan, the Greek word is dekania, for study and prayer listed below, established at their own expense a memorial for the relief of distress in the community. There follows a list of 13 names, including a magistrate of the city, an employee of the imperial court, Palatinos, 2 converts, proselytai, and 2 more Theos Hypsistos. Then there are 5 more names which have been partly erased, including another convert and 1 Samuel, elder and priest, Kohen, The last name of that of Samuel was then added back in the left-hand margin with the information that he came from the city of Perge on the south coast of Asia Minor. One can only speculate as to what row in the community led to some names being erased and one name being put back, but we can only speculate. Oops, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So we have in these inscriptions clear evidence for conversion to Judaism, and also for a group of established associates of the synagogue, to use a neutral word for Theosophes. A permeable boundary to the community is apparent, with some people joining it from outside and others participating in its life and contributing financially without actually converting. Now, controversy has raged in the scholarly literature as to whether Theosophes, those who reverence God, refers to a group with a specific status in relation to Jewish communities. But at least at Aphrodisias, the term clearly refers to a defined group associated with the Jewish community. This is not the place to go into the controversy in detail, but we find at Miletus separate blocks of seats allocated in the theatre for Jews supporting the Blues, one of the chariot racing fan groups, and Theosophes. Both Theosophes and converts are known from a number of places in Roman Asia Minor. It should be noted that the conversion of males to Judaism was technically illegal from about 135 onwards, as circumcision of non-Jewish males was forbidden by imperial edict. But I think it's probable that not all imperial edicts were enforced with equal rigor in all places. So moving forward, the original editors, so if we look at the distribution, this map lifted, I may say, from the copyright belongs to Stephen Mitchell, my colleague Stephen Mitchell, the original map. And I've put on here the location of the principal Jewish communities of Western Asia Minor. And you can see ones which we shall be mentioning. Aphrodisias is here, in quite a long way inland. Miletus is down here, was then on the coast. I shall be mentioning the rather less well-known center of Atmania up here, which has yielded a number of Jewish inscriptions of people who seem to be well integrated into local society. Perge, from where Samuel the priest came, is down here. And the city of Apamea is remarkable for a series of coins referring to Noah and with apparently a picture of the ark on it. So it's one of the probably richest collections of material for the Greek-speaking diaspora of the Jewish world. Now, to revert for a moment to the inscriptions of Aphrodisias, the original editors very tentatively dated the text to the early 3rd century, but cogent arguments have been put forward for a 4th century date. By the way, is everybody still hearing me all right?
Yes.
Fine, good. So I'm getting some buzzing in my speakers, but that's all right, probably feedback. Cogent arguments have been put forward for a 4th century date. It is interesting to see the synagogue expanding its boundaries at a time of generally increasing Christian self-confidence under Christian emperors, who issued increasingly restrictive anti-Jewish legislation. Aphrodisias was not unique in that respect, as we shall see in a moment. It is very possible that the repeated attempts to legislate against Jews, with a tendency to increasingly shrill legal rhetoric, was the product of legislation not actually being very effective. As late as 409, a decree of the emperors Honorius and Theodosius proclaimed somewhat petulantly, although those that have committed this crime, here means abandoning Christianity for Judaism, seems to be an issue at this time, shall be legally condemned under the laws of the ancient emperors, still it does not bother us to admonish repeatedly that those imbued in the Christian mysteries shall not be forced to adopt the Jewish perversity. Neither, I think, should we overestimate the security of the 4th century church. It's rather easy to think, well, Constantine, peace of the church, church was triumphant and, everybody else lost out. It wasn't as simple as that in the 4th century, I think. The reign of Julian, who abandoned Christianity, having been brought up as a Christian, abandoned Christianity and tried to reintroduce a sort of systematized state paganism. That represented an alarming upset for Christians, while some scholars see the anti-Semitic rhetoric of John Chrysostom's sermons, John Chrysostom was Bishop of Antioch, against the Jews in the 380s as the product of insecurity, not dominance. Christian dominance arguably only started to be established with Theodosius's outlawing of all religions except Catholic Christianity in the 390s. And we have to remember that under these emperors that only one sort of Christianity was tolerated. If you were a heretic, you were almost worse off than being a pagan or a Jew. So what might have caused this interest in Jewish communities down into the 4th century? Firstly, I suggest there was the emergence in the pagan world of cults which are either apparently monotheistic or tending towards monotheism, e.g. by proclaiming the superiority of one God over all others, and or which are abstract in concept, no sort of big idolatrous representations. Sometimes the name of the god is very abstract, seems to represent a virtue rather than a mythological personality. And we see these cults moving away from the anthropomorphic deities of traditional Greco-Roman paganism. We find, for example, dedications to the Most High God, the Great God, acclamations of one God, dedications to the Holy and Just. And we will look at some examples of this a little later. Secondly, the Jewish communities of Asia Minor, Syria, and the land of Israel were wealthy and well integrated into the society around them. And we can now pay a little visit to Sardis. Right, this is the entrance courtyard. It's been restored a bit by the excavators of the synagogue of Sardis in Western Asia Minor, looking in from the courtyard through the entrance. And it is indeed a very splendid building. That is inside. If you go through the door and look down the hall, that's what you see. And that faces roughly west-northwest. You can see in the middle there is this enormous marble reading desk, which was probably made from fragments of an earlier building, which I'll mention in a moment. And it's flanked by 2 carved lions, thought by the excavators to have been recycled from an earlier temple of Cybele, which stood nearby. The Cybele, the mother goddess of Anatolia. The building is huge. This main hall is about 50 meters long, with a capacity estimated by the excavators of about 1,000 worshippers. It occupies what an estate agent would call a prestige central location. It's actually it occupies one wing of a 1st century bath complex in the center of town, which was massively developed and rebuilt in the 3rd century, with one wing being occupied then by the synagogue. Rather like Aphrodisias, the original excavators tentatively dated this building, this synagogue, to the 3rd century CE, mainly in the evidence of the names of the people mentioned as donors of the decoration, the mosaics and so on in the inscriptions. However, when these mosaic floors were taken up later for conservation, a number of 4th and even 5th century coins were found sealed underneath. A 4th century date is surprising, but quite possible, as we've seen at Aphrodisias. A 5th century date suggests some rethinking of the impact of Theodosius's crackdown on heretics and non-Christians might be needed, at least in this area. Even more disconcerting was the presence under the floor and forecourt of a few 6th century coins and an oil lamp trapped in some repair masonry of 6th century type. Now, that's the, as I said, another feature rather striking, which one more associates with Byzantine, medieval Byzantine churches, is this great marble seating area at the end, probably for the elders. There are scattered inscriptions referring to presbyteroi, elders of Jewish communities in the Greek-speaking world, and that is presumably where they sit. Nothing quite so grand, I think, these days for synagogue council members, but there you are. It's all on a very lavish scale. As you can see, the floor was all covered with mosaic, and the walls, which we see a little bit of in the next slide, sorry, something's happened. If you turn around in the hall and face back the way you came, where you are very roughly facing towards Jerusalem, I think I understand the plans correctly, you will see again, you can see a bit of the walls. They've restored a bit of the walls. They were all covered with marble plaques. The floor was very good mosaic. And at the end, there are these two kind of pedimented shrines, which were presumably arks to contain the scrolls of the law. It's a little, and I'm not in a position to discuss, since I'm not giving a lecture on the Sardis synagogue, quite why there are two. Did they have an awful lot of scrolls? Did they have some in Greek, some in Hebrew, and so on? Are questions which I'm not going to be able to discuss now. But the question of the dating is awkward, and these coins under the floor pose rather a problem. It's frankly one of those moments where it seems to me, with my historian's hat on, that archaeology and history are pulling in different directions. The fullest discussion of these numismatic finds and their contexts argues for a mid-6th century date for the complex in its final form. Well, a 6th century synagogue has apparently been recorded in the Golan Heights, and indeed repeated 5th and 6th century imperial edicts complain about the continuing illicit construction of synagogues. By that time, it was actually illegal to construct new synagogues in the Roman world. Many historians would, I think, find the idea of a huge synagogue being constructed in the 6th century in a place like Sardis difficult to accept, especially given the presence of a high imperial official, a comes, among the benefactors mentioned in inscriptions on the mosaics. Jews in a place like the Golan were much further removed from imperial and ecclesiastical oversight than the community in Sardis, which lies on a major strategic highway between the Aegean and inland Anatolia, and was a provincial capital under the late empire. Skeptical historians will point to the fact that some of these very late coins are sealed under mortar, but not under the original mosaic flooring, or on the other edges of floors, giving the possibility they may result from late repairs or lost coins falling down cracks. It's very tricky, and the scholar who made this study of the coin evidence, it required him to go back through the original excavators' notebooks behind the published reports on the Sardis synagogue and go into minute details of the exact places they were found. It's a difficult one, and I think it's interesting. It's one of these cases where there's a bit of a history and archaeology seem to be pulling in slightly different directions. So, moving on for a moment. Right, now, I mentioned that these inscriptions are Greek speaking. Only one Greek-Hebrew bilingual text, as far as I'm aware, survives from Asia Minor before the 4th century CE. It's thought to be from the region of Atmania, and as far as I know, it is still in Afyon Museum in central Turkey. At the top, you can see the end here, the end of the word, Greek word for prayers, euchas. And at the bottom, there is some Hebrew. One can see Yisrael, Yerushalayim, and then something or other. The original editors, assisted by a Hebraist colleague, thought that the top might read something like undertake prayers, though really it's very difficult to know what's going on there. And the bottom may have had some formula in front of it, like may there be peace upon Israel and upon Jerusalem, and possibly something like this house or this place. It was probably a plaque from the wall of the synagogue. It's not one text does not appear to be a translation of the other. Was the top a sort of rubric to prompt people to say the prayer in Hebrew underneath? So they had prayer written, which is interesting because that meant some people there at least could read Hebrew. But as I said, this is pretty well unique. Later on, Hebrew does start to reappear on Jewish gravestones across the Mediterranean diaspora. And recently, a few years ago, a building near the south coast of Turkey was excavated from the late 4th century, which yielded a brief word or two of Hebrew. But generally, it's all in Greek. The Sardis synagogue did yield 5 very brief Hebrew texts naming donors, contributors to the decoration of the synagogue, as against 79 in Greek. And there's a story, which of course it's a story in a rabbinic text, so not to be taken as literal historical truth, but it may reflect people's perceptions of the diaspora of Asia Minor. Anyway, this story is apparently in the Tosefta, and it tells of a visit to Sardis by the 2nd century Rabbi Meir. He was there at Purim, and he found no Hebrew text of the Book of Esther for use, and so he proceeds to dictate a copy from memory. So, well, you know, one doesn't know how much weight to put on that sort of thing. But at Apadakmania, further inland, we find Jews commemorated on various tombstones who've held magistracies in the 3rd century CE. And those people seem to have benefited from an edict of the Emperor Septimius Severus, exempting Jews holding civic office in the cities from joining in pagan ceremonies. Now, I think this was not an example of Septimius Severus being suddenly terribly pro-Jewish. The problem was that civic life was kept going in the ancient Mediterranean world by the personal contributions of the magistrates and the councillors. There was no council tax in those days. There were some fairly minor kind of local customs dues, but there was no massive council tax. So a new bathhouse was needed. The councillors had to stump up the money for it. And as time went on, people became reluctant to do this. And so if there was a large and prosperous Jewish community, then assisting them to play their role and take their share was generally in the public interest. So where does this all leave us? What I suggest we have is a kind of very loose model of a kind of circles of decreasing influence outwards from Jewish communities. We have in the middle Jewish communities, and we've talked a bit about those who reference God, the Theos, some of whom were probably pretty well associate members of the Jewish community, like some of the people at Aphrodisias, some of whom may be a little further away, and in a fairly ambivalent relationship hovering between paganism and Judaism, but having some interest in Judaism. And in connection with them, I'm going to talk in a moment about the cult of Theos Hypsistos, God Most High. A little further out, you have evidently pagan texts and dedications which use apparently Judaizing language. And one suspects that some of this language was percolating out through contact with local Jewish communities People visited the local city and picked up the idea that this was an interesting way of talking about God in a world in which paganism was evolving in a kind of, into a less anthropomorphic and less polytheistic mode. You can't be very precise about any of this. And then on the outside, there are other sort of anonymous and abstract gods which are purely pagan and don't show any particular Jewish influence. And what I think underlies this model is a sort of nexus of influences. Now, this is not in any sense a kind of tight model. It's tentative. It's not possible, I think, yet to demonstrate hard paths of influence, chains of influence from one thing to the other, except perhaps in the case of oracles, where we know certain oracles were in circulation, they appear in inscriptions, and they appear to be directly linked to evolutions in cult. Behind these lay probably popular versions of Platonizing and Stoic philosophy, which circulated and again played their role. And also, I think, as I said, Judaism also, I think, played its role. At the same time, local cults were evolving under their own dynamic, which I think probably it's hard to we don't fully understand. And the result was a sort of plethora of cults which are kind of trending towards monotheism or groping after some sort of monotheism. In some cases, this took the form of what some scholars have called henotheism, where there's a proclamation, often with an exclamation, one God, and you proclaim your God is one God, but you don't say he's the only God, but he's one God superior to all the others. Some other texts talk about great is God, or great is such and such a God. Again, and he's the greatest, but the others still are around. And then a further stage beyond that is proper monotheism, where you say there's only one God, and you only reference one God, one in your dedications or your cult. But as I said, this is all rather tentative. And it's, you know, when you've just got random collections of inscriptions to work with, it's very difficult to sort of say, well, yes, this one influenced that one. It's really quite tricky, and I wouldn't want people to think that this is a sort of hard and fast model. So what I want to do now is to move out to looking at the original circles, the nexuses of influence underlie this. Looking at these circles, I'm going to move first of all to say a bit about Theos Hypsistos, and then I'm going to talk a little about apparently Judaizing language in a cult which is definitely pagan. Right, Theos Hypsistos, the Most High God. Not counting a handful of unprovenance texted museums, there are about 226 texts relating to this cult, at least there were when and I may say here I'm indebted to my colleague Stephen Mitchell, who laboriously catalogued all these things published all over the place. Of these 226, about 5%, the dark blue segment, are definitely Jewish from nomenclature or other internal evidence. And a further 1.3%, the very narrow greenish blue segment, are probably Jewish. The purple segment, about 13%, are definitely pagan, where Theos Hypsistos is linked definitely to another deity, or there is explicitly pagan imagery on the stone. That leaves about 68% of the text in a kind of grey area. 59 of these 154 texts are from places where there was a known or probable Jewish community. So we are in an area where, you know, I think you're dealing with a cult. I think Theos Hypsistos, it sort of means roughly the same thing wherever it is, but people are approaching it from very different standpoints, from some people who seem to have been Jewish and using Theos Hypsistos as a term for the God of Israel, to people who are definitely pagan, but chose to address God in this way. The inscriptions are not always very exciting. This is an example of one which is almost certainly Jewish, in fact. It's inscribed along there, Theos Hypsistos kai hagia kataphige, to the Most High God and sacred refuge. And it comes not from one of the sort of big urban Jewish centers of Western Asia Minor, but from the rather obscure city of Sibidunda in Pisidia in the Taurus Mountains of southern Turkey. It probably refers, sacred refuge probably refers to the biblical concept of God as a refuge, cities of refuge, and also phraseology used in the Psalms. There is then a general trend towards a more abstract conception of divinity in the Roman East, but it is also noteworthy that Hypsistos is a fairly frequently used divine epithet in the Septuagint, the early Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, where Hypsistos usually translates the Hebrew El Elyon. This has led some scholars to link the Theos Hypsistos cult to the Theosebes, the god reverencers associated with synagogues. Evidence for the cult of Theos Hypsistos occurs in all the places in the Roman East where such god worship, Theosebes, are known, as well as elsewhere. The island of Kos, Aphrodisias we mentioned, Miletus we mentioned, Tralles, another major city of Western Asia Minor, Philadelphia, a little inland from Sardis, and interestingly, the Crimea. Now, I'm not going to say very much about the Crimea, but there are quite a lot of Theos Hypsistos inscriptions in the Crimea. Some of them are definitely Jewish, from the Jewish, associated with the Jewish community of the city of Golgipia, which is on the Taman Peninsula to the east, the eastern peninsula, which closes off the Sea of Azov. Others are from Tanais, a sort of association of worshippers of Theos Hypsistos is almost certainly of a pagan cult, according to the most recent analysis. Now, interestingly, 4th century Christian writers speak of several groups who worship Theos Hypsistos using buildings which they call prosuchai. Prosuchai is a Greek word frequently used in the Hellenistic and Roman periods by Jews for synagogues. These Christian writers also speak of people worshipping Theos Hypsistos, lighting lamps, and in some cases praying at dawn. The 4th century Christian bishop Gregory of Nazianzus in Central Asia Minor tells us his father belonged to such a group which explicitly mingled Jewish and Greek elements. In the early 5th century, Cyril of Alexandria tells us that one sect of worshippers of Hypsistos called themselves Theosebes, those who reverence God. So some at least of the ambiguous Theos Hypsistos text may be the result of Jewish influence on the worshipper. Whether he was actually regarded as a Theosebes by the local Jewish community or not, or whether he simply felt he was attracted by some elements of Jewish tradition and their monotheism. So pass on to that, not very glamorous inscription. Sorry. Right, if we look at where Theos Hypsistos, now I've now added to the previous map the little blue stars, stars of the Jewish communities. The purple diamonds are the represent places where Theos Hypsistos is found. And you will see that across the west of Asia Minor, there is a degree of correlation between Jewish communities and the cult of Theos Hypsistos. We do find it inland, in more kind of rural areas, like here, where there isn't so far evidence of Jewish communities. But I think that the tie-up or some degree of correlation does rather support the hypothesis that some of the Theos Hypsistos texts do have something to do with the God-fearers. Obviously, those which are explicitly pagan wouldn't. Now, I mentioned prayers at dawn. And if I can now use, and I think probably the cult of Theos Hypsistos provided a very broad tent under which pagans groping towards monotheism, pagan monotheists attached to a solar or fire cult, and those close to the Jewish community could worship the same nameless supreme God. And the situation is, I think, well encapsulated in work done by Ankara Institute colleagues at Inoanda in the mountains of southwest Turkey on a cult area outside the east wall of the city. You see on the left, there's the city wall with a small gate coming out to the outside. An extract from an oracle of Claros, partly known from Lactantius, the Christian fourth century Christian writer, and from another Christian text, was inscribed near a gate. It's there, and there's the original, and there it is. It announces that Aether is the supreme god, of whom all other gods, including Apollo, are messengers. Angeloi in Greek. Angelos just means a messenger, but also in Jewish and Christian usage has the specific sense of angels. And the text prescribes prayer at dawn facing the sunrise. A little way along the wall is a dedication by a certain chromatis of a lamp for which a niche was provided to Theos Hypsistos. Next to this, and I think you can't really see it, but I think it's about there, was a shelf provided for further votive lamps. Interestingly, prayer facing the east, and especially the sunrise, was denounced in Judaism as early as the book of Ezekiel, chapter 8, and was picked up by the Talmudic rabbis. We read in Baba Batra 25a, Rabbi Sheshet also held that the Shekinah is in all the presence of the Shekinah, the presence of God, is in all places. Because when desiring to pray, he used to say to his attendant, it seems he was blind, set me facing any way except the east. And this was not because the presence of God is not there, but because the minim prescribed turning to the east. Now, the word minim in Hebrew means heretic sectarians of some sort, possibly, and sometimes it clearly probably does refer to Christians, but in this case, it fits very neatly with a kind of semi-Jewish group who had, claimed or felt they had some connection with Judaism, but who prayed facing the east. And a further text from the Ankara region, which seems Jewish, but does use some language not normally associated with Jews, is dedicated to the great heavenly most high God and his holy angels and his venerable house of prayer, again using the word prosuke, the technical word for a synagogue in the Greek of this time. So that's the cult site at Inoanda. Some clearly non-Jewish texts dedicated to Theos Hypsistos do also exhibit Judaizing religious language. A gemstone from Egypt of the 3rd or 4th century bears the imprecation, great is the name, do not mistreat me, the most high God be upon you. A text from a Masra in northern Anatolia stresses the invisibility and universal jurisdiction of Theos Hypsistos, while another clearly pagan text from the same area makes a dedication to the noble prayer house, Kyria Prosuke. I mean, the text from other evidence is clearly pagan, but they're using a word which looks as if they picked up from Judaism. I want to turn, if I'm not going on too long, to the final group of texts to deal with. And this is the cult of the holy and just ones. Now, you can see here, this is clearly a pagan text. Here we have some little idols from Kütahya Museum in Western Anatolia. And you can see that these two figures of slightly indeterminate gender, one of whom, the better preserved one here, holds a pair of scales, is presumably justice, and the other one is Hosios, Holy One, holding a staff. And there are a lot of these, and there seem to have been little shrines of these, particularly in the rural parts of Phrygia, the kind of hill country of Western Anatolia. The language does sound vaguely biblical, which is why I want to say a little bit about it now, even if the cult is really fundamentally pagan. Those are very typical of the rural shrines of this cult in inland Anatolia. Here is one which kind of got away. This is standing amidst in the main street of Perge on the south coast, well out of its normal range, and is a much more classicizing kind of thing, a little pillar type dedication altar with a simple, rather nicely lettered inscription. You can just see there, Hosio Kai Dikaio. Rather different from the rustic ones we were looking at just now. Now, if we look at the distribution of this cult, the little red pentangles represent places where Hosios Dikaios inscriptions are found. Also, the kind of pink blobs in these are all quite rural areas. The text I showed you first probably came from that sort of area, the upper valley of the Porsukçay, for those who know Turkey. And in general, the distribution is much more rural than the text of Theos Hypsistos. The cult really had its center in Phrygia, this kind of area up here, and to some extent in the rural parts of Lydia. And in this part of Lydia here with the speckled, the stripy lozenge, is an area which has produced a lot of very interesting pagan cults, Theos Hypsistos, Hostis Dikaios, and a number of curious local cults where the gods seem to have had a sort of judicial role, and people are required to make confession of what they've done wrong, and the god punishes them. It's all very intriguing, but a little bit, I don't think it has anything to do with Judaism and that, and it's not our subject now, but it is a very interesting group of cults. This cult of Hosios Dikaios does sometimes syncretize with other pagan deities, especially the Anatolian Apollo, Helios, the sun god, and the Anatolian rider god, usually represented carrying a double axe over his shoulder. But the identity of Hosios Dikaios is curiously blurred. In about 24% of the 176 texts known to date, Hosios Dikaios appears to be a single deity, especially in the rural parts of Lydia, around these parts. Sometimes only one half of the duo appears, usually associated with another god. Occasionally, one or both deities change from masculine to feminine. A few examples show a tendency towards language appropriate to a sole or supreme god. So we find from Lydia a dedication by Stratonicus, priest of the one and only God and of the holy and just one. And this dedication, so that's one. And at Ephesus, right down on the coast, we find, great is the name of God, great is holiness, great is goodness. From the temple city of Izani up here, we have one God in heaven, great is holiness, great is justice. Intriguingly, in one case, the mason making the inscription appears to have started inscribing Theos Hypsistos to the Most High God, and then altered Hypsisto, Most High, to Hosio, holy. This inscription is from Philadelphia, here to the southeast of Sardis, which did have a Jewish community, and is inscribed to the holy and just God. Meltini made a vow on behalf of her husband Glaucus, and in thanksgiving fulfilled her vow. One or possibly two examples of this cult were dedicated by an association of friends of the angels, and one of the more certain example is this one over here on the right in the slide. Although I have to confess that a later editor, I had this in the article that Tessa mentioned in Talanta, a later editor read one letter differently, which changes friends, association of friends of the angels to association of friends of the vines. Philangelon becomes philanpolon. So we go rather dramatically from angels to drinkers. So much can turn on a half-preserved letter in an inscription. And I thought, well, the Chevalier de Tartevin with the French Association of Burgundy drinkers was rather a nice bit to put on its final slide. So the names, but be serious for a moment, the names Hosios Dikaios may sound a bit biblical, especially if you translate them rather tendentiously as holy and righteous. 6 examples, all of a singular deity, do occur in places with known Jewish communities, but many are from rural areas of Phrygia and Lydia, less exposed to Jewish influence than urban centers. However, it has to be said, Hosios is very rare as a divine epithet in the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures. We do have at Deuteronomy 32:4, Dikaios kai Hosios Kyrios, just and holy is the Lord. The Hebrew here reads Tzedek v'Yashahu, just and right is he. The only other passage, as far as I'm aware, where Hosios is used as an epithet for God is Psalm 145, verse 17. Just is the Lord in all his ways, and holy in all his works. And here Hosid translates actually the Hebrew word chassid. It is not, I think, possible to argue for explicit Jewish influence on the Hosios Dikaios cult, but it was clearly part of the trend towards conceiving of divinity with a less definite anthropomorphic form, where both gender and number appear to be variable. One can only speculate, really, as to whether the presence of well-integrated, wealthy Jewish communities in the region may have contributed to a general trend in that direction. So to conclude, I've tried in this talk to convey something of the prestige and openness to the surrounding community of the major Jewish communities of Asia Minor. I've suggested that that influence may have radiated outwards in circles of decreasingly direct influence, from Theosophes, God respecters, offering worship to the God of Israel, possibly directly in the synagogue, less directly under the name Theos Hypsistos, and then outwards via apparently monotheistic cults using some Jewish religious language to clearly pagan groups using increasingly abstract and quasi-monotheistic language. And I think some of these trends, were, as I noted earlier, were picked up from all kinds of sources, popular philosophy, oracles, and as well as from Judaism. So I hope that has not confused everybody totally, but that's where I would like to conclude, and I'll be very happy to endeavour to deal with questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Anthony, for presenting this wonderful material to us. One wonders what the Jews of in the land of Israel would have made of, well, even of the characters that that sponsored and worshipped in the Sardis synagogue or belonged to the club at Aphrodisias. So it's your interpretation is sort of quite, should I say, as it were, open. Obviously, we really know so little, but inclining to the view that there is some meaning in the traces of Jewishness here, and there's some kind of real Jewish influence of a kind, even if the makers of some of these inscriptions, these these monotheistic inscriptions didn't have much to do with fully fledged Jews in the rural parts where they lived. So I hope that's a fair summary. And obviously there's lots to discuss here. So I'm inviting questions. Those who feel that the chat is tricky, by all means, if your face is actually there, raise a hand and I will hope and try to see you. So I have a question. The first question I have is from Anthony. Perhaps do you want to come on and
Yes, Tessa, thank you. And firstly, Anthony, thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating lecture. I'm particularly interested over what period you've drawn the evidence for at least two, if not more reasons. I mean, firstly, because I suspect the specific words and phrases shift in meaning over time, and I wondered whether you'd like to comment on that. For example, what does Theos Hypsistos mean at any given moment in time over the centuries? And secondly, an even wider question, I suspect that in the antique period, precisely what it meant to be a Jew, in inverted commas, in terms of time and geography, may well have varied. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, indeed. That's a very that is I think a very acute point. Certainly, I think the definition of Jewish boundaries varied, and I think you certainly can't just read straight back from classical rabbinic texts into the Greek-speaking diaspora of this world. I mean, I did refer to some, but such texts, but I think you can't assume that they were just following the rules in the Mishnah and so on. In terms of the evidence, the inscriptions I was looking at, the inscriptions can be very difficult to date, as you will be aware. Probably a lot of these are late 2nd to 4th century. Certainly the term Theos Hypsistos does vary in its, not so much exactly what it means, but kind of what sort of a group it refers to. In an Aphrodisias in the 4th century at Miletus, and I'm afraid I can't remember exactly what the date of that Miletus theatre inscription is, it does seem to refer to a sort of definable group of people. Elsewhere, it can mean just somebody who was, you know, a bit religious and interested in Judaism in a rather general way, and that's probably the sense in which it may be used in, for example, the New Testament at an earlier date. So yes, it varies, I think, both with time and probably with place. As I said, there's been a lot of controversy with people arguing over whether it's a defined group. I think it varies from place to place. I mean, the evidence from Asia Minor for the Jewish community, it's really, there are some inscriptions of the 1st century, but the bulk of it's kind of 2nd, 3rd, and as we now see, 4th.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we have a question from Dudley Miles. I don't know are you visible, Dudley, and would you like to ask your question? Can you hear me? No, in which case I will read it out. Is there evidence of violent suppression of Judaism and pagan cults after 390 CE?
There is certainly evidence of destruction of pagan cults and riots. I mean, there's a somewhat, I think, ambivalent attitude of the authorities. A lot of these evidence were stirred up, particularly in Egypt, by enthusiastic monks. There was the notorious case of the destruction of the Temple of Serapis in Alexandria. And there were also cases now, existing synagogues under imperial law of the late empire were protected. You were not supposed to interfere with them. And sometimes the local Christians got over enthusiastic and burned the local synagogue down. And then there was trouble, in theory. And there is stuff in the law codes about that, about such incidents. So pagans, certainly, the destruction of pagan shrines did occur, sometimes kind of unofficially. Sometimes I think officially. Destruction of synagogues was not supposed to occur officially. That is my understanding. There may be others more expert in late Roman law than much to comment.
I think that's fine. And Gary Rensburg, hello, and you have a question.
Thank you, Tessa, and thank you, Anthony. Very wonderful material. Thank you for opening our eyes to all of this. So if you said this, I missed it. I just want to ask a question and a second question. More importantly, prosuche is still being used, as you said. So is the word synagogos appearing anywhere? I'm thinking of what's happening in Egypt and in the land of Israel, where the former seems to not be used after a certain time and morphs into the latter. I'm not an expert in the Greek inscriptions, but that seems to be what I have read and learned. So what's happening in Asia Minor, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, as far as the name for the place? Secondly, minor question, I have a wonderful line drawing of the Sardis menorah with the famous Socrates inscription that I use for teaching, but I have never been able to find a photograph of it. And does you or anyone else know where one can get a photo of it? Thank you.
No, but it should be, presumably it should be somewhere in the now rather voluminous publications of the Sardis synagogue. But no, I can't put my finger on that, I'm afraid. In terms of prosuche, I'm not sure. It starts being used in the Hellenistic period, I think, with the remains of the synagogue on Delos, the island of Delos, and it continues well down into the Roman period in Asia Minor. I'm not sure that the word. I really wouldn't like to be definite about this. Sorry, but I think the word prosuche continues well down into the Roman period.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again. On the Socrates menorah, yeah, it is a wonderful thing to talk about with students, isn't it? And it's not clear if it's the stonemason who is Socrates or the donor, it seems to me. But in any case, I thought I did have a photo, but I will look. Otherwise, possibly Stephen Fine might do. I'm sure I can track one down for you. If Gary, if
Thank
that
you.
would help. Let's see. Nicole Belaish, hello. Are you there? Can you hear me? Madame Belaish?
Hello.
Hello.
Do you hear me?
Now we can hear you, yes.
Okay, I try to, I can't succeed in, yes, here is
yes, there you are. Good, it's lovely to have you with us, please.
I'm very happy with your invitation, and thank you so much, Mr. Sheppard, for your lecture, because as Tessa, I knew you through your Talenta paper. So considering both your argument and the importance of the Jewish community in Sardis, how do you explain the lack of evidence for Theos Hypsistos and for Osios Dikaios as well?
Osios Dikaios, I think that is primarily a rural cult, although there are examples which crop up nearer to cities. I wouldn't necessarily expect it in a place like Sardis.
But it is in Philadelphia.
Yes, it is found in Philadelphia. I mean, I think when I say Philadelphia, that includes the territory of Philadelphia. So
okay.
It's not necessarily in, well, Philadelphia has never been excavated as a modern town on top of it. So in terms of Theos Hypsistos, we are dealing obviously with the Sardis with a synagogue. There are some inscriptions mentioning Theosebes there. Some of them do mention Theosebes, if I remember correctly. There is no mention of Theos Hypsistos, but I think you wouldn't necessarily expect to find that actually in a synagogue.
No, not in the synagogue.
No, but it so happens that there aren't any such actually from Sardis. So I mean, one's always dealing with the sort of chances of survival in this thing. It's possible that the synagogue was so dominated the interests of groups who had that kind of interest that they gravitated to the synagogue rather than did their own thing with Theos Hypsistos. It's a bit, I'm speaking a little off the top of my head, but it is such a very prestigious building in such a prestigious place that it's going to be quite dominate the religious interests of those people in the town who were attracted towards monotheism.
Thank you.
Can I just interject a question which might link on? I mean, I'm just wondering whether the boot could be on the other foot. I mean, how would it work, Anthony, if one were to say that in late paganism, the language of some of the language of Judaism and Christianity and the conceptualization has penetrated existing cults or created new forms of cult, and that, for example, the Hosios Kai Dikaios, holy and just type of inscription, has a faint resonance or echo of that kind of language, but has nothing to do with Jews, or nothing, at least, that the exponents of the cult and the authors of those inscriptions would have been aware of. That's the sort of other extreme of interpretation. Do you think it is still viable, is really my question, even if not our preferred reading?
You mean that well, I mean, I think I was tending to the view that Hosios Dikaios is purely pagan, that although I think it's very far removed from Judaism, even if there are one or two examples which trend towards monotheism more, where Hosion Dikaion becomes a sort of singularity. I mean, that is a trend already evident in paganism, irrespective of any Jewish influence. So if there was any Jewish influence, it's very tenuous. And I think to some extent, I think we're dealing with people picking up and exploiting and recycling half understood ideas, whether from philosophy or from Judaism. So yes, I think I wouldn't want to make any close connection between Hosios Dikaios and Judaism.
Oh, sorry, in that case, I somewhat misunderstood.
Yes, I perhaps was
trying to make the connection.
I think it's very, very weak. There are some sort of pointers, but they're pretty slight, and I think I mean, most of the inscriptions there's a lot of pagan iconography in them, and so I think it's not, it's hard it would only be the most tenuous kind of garbled influence, I think, if any. Sorry, it's very difficult with these things.
Yes, so in effect, well, my extreme case is more or less where you were going, without even wanting to posit an influence at several removes from, excellent, good. So I don't want to, I have something from Umut Dint. Are you there, Umut? Or, hello, yes, please, ask away. Would you like to ask your question? You're still muted. You can unmute yourself, or I can unmute you, I think. No, I can't. All right, I'll ask the question. Do we know the job of Theos Hypsistos groups, whether or not they were official persons in the Roman Empire?
They mostly appear to be, I mean, the thing is, they're just brief dedications, most of them. So you very rarely have any indication of occupation or anything like that. There are a few Roman citizens among them, but I mean, I'd have to have a quick look back through Stephen Mitchell's extremely useful catalogue and just see what who exactly is in there.
Right. And Nick, Brett, you have a question and an observation, but you are muted. You can unmute yourself if you wish.
I'll unmute myself. Yes, you spoke about the synagogue facing towards Jerusalem.
Mm.
Sort of how accurate is it facing? Is it approximately, or is it fairly accurate?
I wouldn't like to say, because it's a long time since I was personally in Sardis, and you have to go there with the right sort of compass and know the bearing. So I don't know. It's roughly right, I would say, judging from the published plans. But I couldn't be precise. And as I said, it's slightly odd because you come in, and as you walk in, your back is to what appears to be the two ark niches. But then the people at the reading desk are facing the ark and facing roughly towards Jerusalem. But how accurate the alignment is, I don't know. It may not be strictly accurate, because the building basically took over one wing of this pre-existing first century bathhouse.
It's just that the Samaritan synagogues had a qibla which faced Mount Gerizim. So it could well be that tradition has been carried over.
I've never heard a suggestion the Sardis synagogue is a Samaritan.
No, but Samaritan synagogues,
yes,
face Mount Gerizim. And
yes,
Samaritan. It's just that's a tradition of facing your holy place.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
The next thing is the inscription. We had about angels and drinkers. We have Tacitus saying that the Jews worship Dionysus.
Sorry, I was being a bit lighthearted. Just that it was simply, my point there was simply that the two first editors of the inscription read it as friends of the angels. But if you change, but the letter, the word for friends of angels is philangelon. The letter N is right on the crack in the inscription. And the next editor who read it, Professor Malai Vismir, read it as philampalone with an M, which then means friends of the vines. So, yeah, it's just a question of how you read the text. Yeah.
Well, that seems a good note on which to end. It would have been better if we could have now moved on to a real drink and all shown our friendship with the vine, but some of us might do something of the kind in our own homes. And so with warm thanks to the audience for coming and listening. It's been very nice to have you all, especially to have people from, as I say, Turkey, which is a first, from France, and even those nearer to home are extremely welcome. Thank you, Anthony, for an very instructive and agreeable lecture. I think we've all enjoyed it and learned a lot. Can we all applaud Anthony in the best way we can manage?
Well, thank you all very much for coming along, and to what might have been perhaps appeared a rather unknown quantity, but anyway, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed revisiting some older things.
Oh, indeed, yes, and thank you all for the discussion, which was worthwhile. Thank you.
And of course, things have been transformed by Stephen Mitchell's work in the field over decades. Yeah. When you started, there was no corpus by.
Well, no, I mean the catalogues of these things, and similarly Professor Rika of Belgrade, who's catalogued the Hosios Dikaios ones, and without that, I mean, you just spend hours chasing through periodicals for all these things.
Yeah, it's quite. And then decided they're not relevant because they're not Jewish anyway.
Well, I think it's worth looking at, because no one's, as far as I know, there are one or two passing remarks where people say, of course, this isn't Jewish, but no one's actually said, well, looked at them and said, well, why? Because the language is a bit sort of seductive. But I think.
Yeah. May I also just say to people that in the chat, is Gary still there? Yes, there's a suggestion that Jody Magnus will have a copy of the a picture of the Sardis inscription, which is a good point. And there is Ewan Bowie saying, thank you very much to you, Anthony. And it's been nice to have you, Ewan, wherever.
Indeed, yes, nice to see you.
Yes. All right. Well, I think, Anthony Rabin, we can now conclude our proceedings. So bye, everybody. And again, season's greetings.